See, I've been on a quest my entire career. I've been on a quest to find out what it means to be a faithful interpreter. That's our stewardship. As we have received God's word, we want to receive it and be faithful. We have to start with how we think about the Bible, what it is, what we do with it. How do we approach it? How do we get God's message and not have that all blurred by our own messages?
There's some category shifting that needs to take place, and I at least want to put the categories on the table, help us identify the problem, and maybe this isn't your problem, but I guarantee that it's a problem for somebody that you know and care about.
The beginnings of a new series on the paradigm that we use at Bible Project, the paradigm for how we view the Bible. And so this is very kind of foundational stuff that we're talking about. And so I'm here with Tim Mackey. Hey, Tim.
Hey there.
And Carissa Quinn.
Hey, John.
Is joining us. Carissa, you weren't in the first two conversations. The first conversation, we just talked about what is a paradigm and what are three kind of unhelpful paradigms that have good intuitions, but ultimately kind of leave the Bible flatter than it should be.
Or I'm trying to make it do things that it wasn't quite designed to do in that way.
Yeah. And then in the second episode, we talked about the first attribute of the paradigm. We've broken down the paradigm into 7 attributes.
Yeah. Or aspects.
Or aspects or
axioms, whatever.
Yeah, whatever word we want to use.
Yeah.
The first one is that it is both human and divine. That was a great conversation about God using humans and the Bible not being made in spite of humans, but in collaboration with humans.
Yeah. Importantly and necessarily through humans. Very intelligent ones, too.
Yeah.
The biblical authors, I mean, like highly intelligent human beings.
Yeah.
Yes. And we'll talk about that more.
It starts with recognizing something about the Bible, a quality that it has, which is the word authority. You might use lots of other words. There are plenty of words we can use to describe what the Bible is. But it has authority. And here's the thing about authority. When we recognize authority, our job is to submit to it. That's what authority is all about. We submit to it. And as we submit to the Bible's authority, that can move us along to become faithful interpreters. And we show that submission to its authority by holding ourselves accountable. We want to be accountable as we come to the text and try to understand it better. Now, how do we think about this accountability? Well, we're accountable to the truth claims. We believe the Bible is true. Again, whatever words you use to describe that, the Bible is true, and therefore it has truth claims to make. And that's what we're accountable to as we submit to its authority. And we understand then that those claims are communicated by human instruments that God has chosen. You know, God could have done revelation dozens of different ways, I imagine. But he chose to use human instruments. And therefore, these human instruments have conveyed God's message to us. Okay, so God worked through that doorway, through that portal, those human instruments, to get the message to us. That means if we're going to get the message, what do we have to do? Go back through that. Our way to get to God's message is to go through those human instruments that he chose. Therefore, if we want to be accountable to God's authority in Scripture, we have to be accountable to those human instruments, because God's message is invested in those human instruments. So we want to know what their purposes were, what their intentions were. And we don't do that by psychoanalyzing them. It's not an issue of, kind of what did you think of your mother and what did you have for breakfast. We're not trying to get into their heads. We're trying to delve into their literature, because they have communicated, and we believe that they've communicated effectively. So we then approach God's authority and God's message by trying to understand as best we can the message of the authors. Now, I include in that the compilers and things of that sort, but I'll just call them the authors, the human instruments.
Yeah.
So this is the next step,
Yep.
that it's unified literature.
Yeah, unified is a word used in our short tagline.
Yeah.
A unified story leads to Jesus. What do we mean by unified?
When I hear unified, I think of the word coherence. It's a coherent story. So there's one story, there's even maybe a narrative thread through that entire story, but that is really hard to fathom when we're talking about so many different authors over a long period
over
of time.
1,000 years,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, yeah.
Spanning
that's right.
continents.
Yep, that's right. So we did craft a sentence to try and summarize
Oh,
this
yes.
Oh, good.
here. Here's the sentence that we crafted. The Bible has many authors, many literary styles, and many themes, but it is telling one story about God's rescue of humanity to be his partners in ruling the world. So there's kind of two implications there, that it's a diverse collection with lots of manys, many different authors, many different books and scrolls. Each scroll contains a variety of literary styles and topics or themes.
And by literary styles, you mean?
Poetry, narrative, discourse, proverbs,
Yeah,
that kind of stuff. So that's emphasizing that it's a collection that's diverse. But it has been unified in a couple important ways. One is what you could say is an editorial or compositional unity. In the same way that an author could bring to create an anthology. Authors often do this, especially in different fields, like a professor of philosophy will collect some of the key essays of important philosophers throughout history and then bring them together, selections, and then write introductions and conclusions and essays that bring it all together. It's anthology. So that's a diverse work with diverse authors and origins, but that's been brought together under one unified whole.
And what's interesting about that example is that all the literary styles are going to be very similar. They're all just like philosophical, like didactic, probably kind of discussions.
Yeah.
And what makes the Bible even more interesting is not only is it an anthology of sorts, but it's such an eclectic anthology, which makes it feel more like an art project, to me.
So maybe the coherence is a little bit harder for us to identify because we're not really used to seeing that kind of an anthology.
Okay, so I think there's two ways to talk about the unity of the Bible. One is this anthological, there's the editorial, anthological unity to it.
Okay.
On one level, and we can talk about that. But then it's also unified in terms of its content, that there is a governing narrative.
Yes.
From beginning to end, that isn't like an organizing principle.
And that's where, like, if you went to some sort of art show that had an overall, like, theme.
Yeah, that's right.
But there's projections on the wall, and there's paintings, and there's someone doing spoken word. And so it's like, feels very eclectic, but there's like a common motif and ideas that are recurring. So when you're done, there is a sense of coherence. The Bible kind of does that as well.
Yeah.
When we say the Bible's unified literature, what we're taking for granted is that it is an eclectic anthology.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people don't maybe realize that when they open the Bible, that they're actually coming to a library of many different scrolls written in different literary styles by different authors.
Yeah, so maybe let's start there. Let's make that a marker post right now. So let's just say you open a Bible and you look at the table of contents, you'll see there's two major collections in a Christian Bible, Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox Bible. There's two main sections, one called the Old Testament, that we call usually the Hebrew Bible in our conversations, and then the New Testament. And it's helpful to understand the unity of the Bible. It's helpful, in my mind, to separate those two collections because they each have a unique formation history
Yeah.
that is a little bit different.
Yes.
So it's helpful in my mind to separate them out and to talk a little bit about the editorial unity and history of the Hebrew Bible.
One Bible, two collections.
One Bible, two collections, each with a different formation history, but one governing narrative that spans both collections.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Hebrew Bible. So depending on the form in which you encounter the Old Testament, whether it's in a Protestant Bible, a Catholic Bible, an Orthodox Bible, or a Jewish Bible, there's going to be a different number of books in your table of contents for the Old Testament.
Okay. Oldest would be the Jewish Hebrew Bible.
Yep. So this is a
The
couple
Tanakh.
centuries before Jesus. Yes.
The Tanakh.
which is an acronym.
For Torah, which means law, instruction, Nebi'im, which means prophets, and then Ketuvim, which is the writings. So same books as a Protestant Bible, different order,
Yeah.
and different groupings.
Different groupings. So for shorthand, just called the Jewish Bible or the Hebrew Bible, has 24 separate scrolls that have been organized together into those three parts you just named. If you look at a Protestant Old Testament, it's the same.
It's the same books.
Same books, but that have been divided up differently so that you get a total of 39. There's 24 scrolls, and each of those scrolls, the material within it, has a distinct origin in the history of the people of Israel, like a museum exhibit on Egypt. Each room will come from a different maybe period or focus on different characters. And so the literature was growing and accumulating all throughout over a
Yeah, these were the
1,000-year
only
period.
scrolls that they were like writing and reading and
Oh, that's
working
right.
on.
Yeah. They're meant, in fact, the sources of the material that we find in the biblical scrolls is often referred to.
In the Bible itself.
Correct. Yeah. So there'll be a poem in Numbers, and it'll say, hey, dear reader, this poem comes from the scroll of Yashar. Or the author of Chronicles is constantly quoting all these sources that are found nowhere in the Hebrew Bible itself.
Yeah.
I got this from the scroll of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah or something like that. So, yeah, okay. So the Hebrew Bible is a selection of a much larger literary tradition of ancient Israel.
Yes.
For here, we're just saying it's a collection that's over 1,000 years in the making.
Yeah.
And each scroll, the material in it began in different points in people and institutions in Israel's history. So Leviticus clearly has like some priestly tech manual origins, you know?
Right.
Whereas the writings of Isaiah come from Isaiah and his disciples in Jerusalem at a particular moment. Moses starts writing, we're told, in the wilderness journey. So all these different comes together. And you can go throughout the history of interpretation, and Jewish and early Christian scholars throughout history just read the last paragraph of Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
Yes,
And
right.
like something will really stick out to you.
Moses died.
Yes.
And then someone, a later editor, says, hey,
Dear reader,
yeah,
Yeah.
you know, a prophet like Moses has never, ever come along since him.
Yeah.
It's clearly somebody's voice who's not only other than Moses, putting the final touch on the Torah, but it's somebody like long after Moses.
Yeah.
Which the comment only makes the sense it does, if that's the case.
Yeah, I think it helps to think about these editors and or redactors as also filled with the Spirit. And
Yes,
so
yeah,
it's
yeah.
not just the original authors, but it's the authors and editors that shaped the story later too that are
Yeah.
part of this Spirit-filled community.
So that's our accountability. Our ultimate accountability is to God, but it's worked out at the level of interpretation by being accountable to the human authors, okay? Following the logic here. So when we think about authority, we understand that God's purpose is carried out through these human purposes. It's what he chose to do to make it work. And therefore, his authority is invested in those human authors. And that means it's their intentions that interest us. That's why I say that the Bible is written for us. It's written for everybody. It's for us, God's message for everyone. But it is not written to us. Now, if you struggle with that concept, we could solve it very quickly. I could just grab my Hebrew Bible and hold it out to you and say, go ahead and read. And you'd say, well, it looks like chicken scratch to me. Well, that's the language God wrote in. And since it's not a language that most of you know it's not written to you. It's written to a different audience that spoke a different language at a different time in a different culture. And so that means that the message is for all of us. It transcends that culture, but it's bound into that culture. And that means that if we're going to understand it, we have to, here's the hard word, work, right? This is going to take a little effort on our part. But isn't God's word worth it? So a little bit of effort on our part. Now, the way I express this is by using a metaphor that I refer to as the cultural river. Let's start by talking about our particular cultural river. Now, various words are coming up on the screen that give some definition to some of the currents, you like that, currents in the river, okay? Some of the currents in our cultural river. And you'll recognize all of these things. And some of them are things that you say, yes, that's us, that's me, that's what we are, and we love being that way. But you're going to look at others and you say, well, I didn't like that one, I'd rather not do that, That's how cultural river is. Cultural river doesn't suit itself to any of our individual preferences. It's just, this is what we live in. For good or ill, the authors of the Old Testament, the Israelite authors of the Old Testament, to whom we are accountable, remember, know nothing of this cultural river. These words wouldn't make sense to them, even if we translated them into Hebrew. The ideas would be totally foreign to them. They would have no idea what these things were about. And that means if we are trying to hold ourselves accountable to their intentions, we don't dare try to slip our cultural river in between the lines. We don't expect to go to Proverbs and find verses about social media. We don't expect to go into Kings and find discussions of monarchy versus democracy. We don't expect to go to Deuteronomy and find discussions of market economy and capitalism. And we shouldn't expect to go to Genesis and find discussions of science. It's not their cultural river. And we dare not impose our cultural river on the text. So what's their cultural river look like? Well, let's talk about it a bit. Kingship, I know what kingship is. Well, you know what you think about kingship today, and by the way, none of it's very good, right? But when they thought about kingship in the ancient world, they didn't think that. They knew they had some bad kings, but their idea of kingship was an idealistic one that was benevolent, that was important to structuring society. We talk about how important it is to have law and order. For them, the king represented law and order. So they've got their cultural river. They don't know ours, and we are largely uninformed about theirs. But if we're going to be accountable to the intentions of those authors, we have to make the trip.
What's up, everybody? I want to thank you so much for watching. 2007, I graduated with a Bible major, and I thought I knew what the Bible was. 3 years ago, I discovered the Bible Project, and I found out that I knew nothing, and that I went through a process over the past 3 years of completely rediscovering the Bible on its own terms, and I still have so much to learn. And I want you guys to come along the journey with me. This is an awesome series. We're going to be exploring what is the Bible, rediscovering the Bible on its own terms. We'll have several installments in this series, and I think you're going to love it. I want to ask, if you guys haven't already, please subscribe. And I'm so excited for what's coming. So if you could, press the like button, share this, subscribe, do what you can do to help us get this message out about what God has done for this world and the good news that we have because of Jesus. Let's discover the Bible together.
And then biblical literature, as an example, has a different kind of authorial history than how we imagine it today. It's traditional literature. It's community traditional literature, which doesn't mean it was written by anybody and everybody, but it was literature that was studied, edited, compiled, reshaped over the course of many generations. And that's a part of its origins that's, I think, different than how we think of books today.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think about what this means for readers as we approach the Bible as a unified story.
Yeah.
The fact that there's this earlier collection that is studied and maybe edited or redacted into the overall storyline, but then there are these later works. At least one thing that makes me think of is that as we read the later works, so like the prophets and the writings, that we should be looking for how they're reflecting on the Torah, the earlier parts. They've studied them and they're weaving together those themes. So reading the Bible as a unified story, it'll look for developments from the Torah through the prophets, through the writings.
Yeah, that's right. There was a big wave of Hebrew Bible scholarship that was trying to reverse engineer the collection of the Hebrew Bible to break it back into its previous parts and stages. And
with the earliest being the most authentic.
In theory.
Yeah, in theory. And
That's right.
this is important to talk about because we're saying that these are different layers, but they actually form one unified story, which is a specific way of viewing the text of the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, and to combine it with our conversation last time about human and divine and the word inspiration, meaning people guided by the Spirit, what some traditions of Christianity have tended to do is to limit the God-breathed nature of these documents to the activity of the handful of people named. Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah.
And not the guy who wrote the last paragraph.
And when you limit it to the named people, we're ignoring the historical reality that it was generations of prophets and scribes and disciples of Isaiah that are talked about in the book of Isaiah as the people who inherited the first version of the book of Isaiah. Or Baruch, who's mentioned in Jeremiah as the author of the scroll of Jeremiah. Not Jeremiah himself, but a guy named Baruch, who's mentioned in the book. So we have to, I think, adjust our view of inspiration to the way it's actually talked about in the Bible itself, which is that it's a community of prophets and people who saw themselves as part of the composition history of this collection. The production of new material didn't stop. The Hebrew Bible itself was created out of a bunch of pre-existing ancient Israelite literature and through time. But it also came into existence during a period of great literary fruitfulness of the Jewish people. And so there's lots of other Second Temple Jewish literature that even some Jewish communities also treated with the same status as the books of the Hebrew Bible. And so you have to kind of think of a Venn diagram. You've got like Sadducees, they're running the temple. You've got Pharisees. They wish they were running the temple. You've got the Dead Sea Scroll community, and they tried to run the temple, but they got kicked out, and so they went out to the desert and hate everybody else. And then you've got the Messianic Jewish community, and all the other writings, they take for granted that there's this kind of core to the aspen grove. But there's also a lot of other literature that was accorded different status in different communities. And so this is where the books that became the Deuterocanon or the Apocrypha, there's nothing Catholic or Orthodox about these texts. They're just Second Temple Jewish literature.
Jewish, Second Temple Jewish literature. These are the Maccabees. This is Enoch.
Enoch, Jubilees, the Wisdom of Ben Sira. And some of it involves second or third editions of Tanakh books.
Oh, right. Like Daniel has an upgrade.
There's a Daniel 2.0. There's an Esther 2.0. And dude, it's so awesome. Because the 2.0 of Esther, for example, takes the book of Esther and situates it with all of this new material that hyperlinks it through design patterns into the stories of the Exodus and the stories of Genesis. The whole question is, when you talk about the history of the literature, the development of Jewish literature didn't stop magically one day when the Hebrew Bible was finished.
Pens down. We did it.
Jewish literature kept growing, and it all kept growing like a snowball, though. Just like the way the book of Chronicles is riffing off of Genesis through Kings and developing it, but in light of different things. So the Wisdom of Ben Sira is riffing off of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job and Genesis all together. It's doing biblical theology. And so that process never stopped. It kept on going. And so the question is the line where you say, okay, we're going to take this part of the tradition and this section of it as coming from God, but this part not. And so traditionally where Christians have done this is to say, well, what was Jesus's Bible? The only reason I read this literature in the first place is because I follow the Jewish Messiah. But here we are. We've staked our adult lives on trying to understand this literature and help other people understand it. It's weird. Why is that? I'm a follower of Jesus. And so you guys are too. And so that's why we care about this.
Okay.
So what was the literature that Jesus referred to as the scriptures that he said were about him? And He refers to the three-part shape of this literature that corresponds, as far as we can tell, to the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh.
The Tanakh.
While Jesus and the apostles allude to and use language from other Jewish literature of the time,
Yeah.
they don't, as a general pattern, refer to it with the same type of status as coming from a divine origin.
But they value it.
But
It's
they value it.
useful to read. It's true, but yeah, different.
But, when Jesus quotes from the Torah or from the prophets, he'll say, as the scriptures say, sometimes he'll even say, as God says. But, for example, the famous saying where Jesus is like, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, I'll give you rest. He's riffing off of a little line out of the Wisdom of Ben Sira,
Oh, really?
which is where Lady Wisdom says, come to me, all who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest.
And Ben Sira is riffing off of Proverbs.
Ben Sira is riffing off of Proverbs. But Jesus doesn't say, as it says in the scriptures, or as it says in the Wisdom of Ben Sira.
Yeah.
He just adopts it. And that's a pattern. Whenever Jesus and the apostles quote from or allude to other Second Temple literature, they don't mark it with the same types of little markers as when they say, as the scriptures say. There's one very important exception, and that's in the letter from Jesus' brother, Jude, where he quotes from the scroll of Enoch and seems to accord it, with divine authority, like you would quote from Isaiah or Jeremiah.
Interesting.
But it's what he quotes and why is so fascinating and rad. Because the book of Enoch is itself just riffing off of design patterns in Genesis and Deuteronomy and Isaiah and...
So there needs to be a little humility.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
But, man, this seems really important, right?
Totally.
Like,
Yeah. Because think about it. Where would you even encounter the collection?
oh, yeah.
True.
It's
Yeah.
not bound up in one
It's
book.
not in one volume. It's a
It's a
collection,
collection
of scrolls.
And not every tabernacle, what do they call them? Sorry.
Synagogue.
Synagogue
Correct.
is going to have the whole collection.
Right.
That's right.
But these are the texts that they're consistently going to be talking about.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
It
Hearing.
exists in their mind
Yeah.
as a collection.
Yeah.
Correct. Yep, that's right.
And I think there's also something to what John pointed out before we started talking about how there are 24 books in the Jewish Tanakh.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
right. That's
That
right.
it's
That feels very complete.
it's 2 times 12, which is like
Yep.
the number for completeness.
Yeah. The design of the 24 scrolls of the Tanakh, I think, give us the clues that there was a bounded collection that is that. And it corresponds to the Protestant Old Testament. And those are the books that do, for the most part, when they get quoted by Jesus and the apostles, they ascribe them a divine authority that's different. But again, if we could just go interview your average Jew in the Second Temple period, they didn't ever see it in one volume the way we do. And they wouldn't have conceived of it as a book. The Tanakh, as we encounter it, the whole collection is spun out of the first few literary units of the Genesis scroll. So the creation and the Eden stories, and the stories of the flood and the scattering of Babylon and the choosing of Abraham, that sequence right there sets the vocabulary, literary themes that are just going to be on recycle. And
Right.
every scroll in the Tanakh collection is riffing off of stuff going on in those early chapters.
And what are those themes?
Yeah, God is the great creator and provider
Giver of life.
order and life. He's installed humanity as an image through whom to rule the world and to steward its fruitfulness. Humans do a really poor job.
Violence and
Yeah, we take God's gifts and we use them to aggrandize ourselves and our agendas, and a lot of people get hurt in the process. So out of the decreation, he saves a remnant, chooses a remnant, and gives them a chance of becoming humanity 2.0. And that happens with Noah, and then with Abraham, and then with Isaac, and then with Jacob, and then so on.
this is the cycle of God
Yeah.
creating,
Yeah.
establishing a human, and at first all humanity,
Mhm.
but then picking humans, like, okay, let's try again. Failing, some sort of decreation,
Yep.
and then selecting then a human again.
Yep. It's like a melody.
It's like a melody
Yeah.
that's repeating. It's very clear in Genesis,
Mm-hmm.
and that just continues on through
Just
the whole
continues.
Hebrew Bible.
It's what all the Torah and the prophets are about. And the Babylonian exile is portrayed as the ultimate catastrophic flood that happened to the chosen people of the family of Abraham. A remnant returned,
Yeah.
and
The root.
the Hebrew Bible comes from that remnant, which has taken the whole collection and oriented it around a future hope about God raising up someone from among the remnant who will do for Israel and for the world what none of us seem to be able to do for ourselves. The seed of the woman, the snake crusher, the Messiah. And so that's where the Hebrew Bible is organized in terms of content and theme about the hope for a future human who will reverse the failure at Eden and reverse Israel's failure and release God's blessing to all of the world. Every book in the Tanakh is about that in some way. If I can't see how it's about that, the problem is probably more to do with my assumptions. For many people, divergent details in accounts of the same event happen all over the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
And so if your assumption is, well, this is a historical record of the history of ancient Israel, those are going to be problems or contradictions. But a contradiction in a collection of texts is in the eye of the beholder. The fact that a recipe book, like you turn to one page and the recipe is really different than the recipe 20 pages later. Oh, it's a contradiction. Well, no, the contradiction is only in your assumptions that a recipe book should have all the same recipes. Like, that's a wrong assumption.
Yes.
So in the same way, if my assumptions about what the Bible is lead me to see contradictions in it, maybe my assumption is the problem, not the Bible. But the point is just saying, in a diverse collection, there's going to be diversity.
Yes.
And if I can see, oh, it was brought together in this particular way as an anthology, but has been given a unified shape in its final form.
For here, we're talking about the unified, highly designed, editorialized, unified shape that the Hebrew Bible came into be.
Yeah.
Very specific and beautifully designed.
That's right. Yeah. Designed as an editorial unity.
Yeah.
And unified in terms of its
themes and story.
Themes and governing storyline and concepts. And I like how you put that, Carissa. It's a collection that tolerates enormous diversity in terms of content and literary style, but it's unified in really clear and obvious ways if you have eyes to see it.
All right. And so that's the Hebrew Bible, and all our questions are answered. Thank you for that. And we'll jump in next to the formation of the New Testament and how that's part of the unified story.
Yeah.